All right, let's turn tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11. I know that just saying it makes us go, uh-oh. This is, this chapter is David, unfortunately, at his worst. And we're going to be able to look at it in pieces. We're going to try to cover it bit by bit. We probably won't get very far tonight because there's a lot that's in this chapter. But we are reminded that the Bible is a completely honest book. The Bible reveals some of the flaws of even its greatest characters. And whether that's Abraham or Moses or David or Elijah or Peter or the other apostles, men are flawed characters. And we would much rather the snapshot of our life be told without any of the ugliness, right? Without any of those kind of details. The Bible doesn't do that. The Bible doesn't hide from us that men are sinners and that the best of men are still men at best. And so tonight we're going to be able to see David hasn't been perfect so far, but David's been a really good king. David's been a great king. David's been a good man. He's the sweet psalmist of Israel. He's the man that the Bible says is after God's own heart. But he hasn't been perfect. We haven't seen it through completely rose-colored glasses. He's made his mistakes here and there. He's fell prone to a couple things. But chapter 11 is really where we see David, I think, at his worst as far as the Scripture is concerned. So we have to balance. We have to learn that if we are going to learn from the successes of men, we should also try to learn from their failures. Okay, so we're not going to bypass chapter 11. We're going to look at it. We'll try to handle it honestly and see if we can learn from it. Okay, if we want to learn from David's successes, let's learn from his failures as well. Now, we'll call tonight, David falls to temptation. Okay, David falls to temptation. And we'll try to cover 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1 down. I don't know that we'll get much past verse number 5. Number 1, David lingers. David lingers. I mentioned last week at the end that we would end last week where we would start tonight. Verse number 1 says that it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. Now chapter 11 opens up at a certain time of year. It's called the time when kings go forth to battle. As we were finishing last week, we kind of started to discuss that. Now, in that part of the world, it's generally or hasn't been or wouldn't have been considered wise to try to fight wars during certain times of year, especially if you want to talk about a cold, a wet, a rainy, cold, wintry time or season. Things like travel, how to get supplies to your troops, those kind of things would have made certain times of year not really wise to war. And that's what we were looking at the end of chapter 10. Now, when Ammon fled in chapter 10, verse number 14, the Bible tells us that Joab made the decision not to pursue any longer, but to return home, right? Chapter 10, verse 14 said that when the children of Ammon saw that the Syrians were fled, then fled they also before Abishai and entered into the city. So Joab returned from the children of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. Now, we're not blaming Joab for that. It wasn't the right time, apparently. This was kind of understood. The Bible doesn't condemn him for that or criticize him for making the decision that he did. But when Ammon retreated home and holed themselves up in their city, Joab made the decision to return back to Jerusalem. That doesn't mean that Ammon is off the hook for the nonsense that they started in chapter 10. David reached out to the Ammonites in good faith. When their king died, David sent ambassadors to his son with condolences and well wishes. If nothing else, just an olive branch, right? A kind word to a family that had just lost their father and to a nation that had just lost their king. We don't have any reason to suspect any ill intentions or foul play involved. When David reached out to them, he sends ambassadors to comfort them, the Bible says. Well, chapter 10, verses 3 and 4 tell us how those ambassadors were received. They were humiliated. Their intentions and David's well wishes were suspect to criticism. They said, no, that's not what he has in mind. These guys are spies. They've come to spy us out. And they were humiliated. They cut off part of their beards, cut off part of their garments, embarrassed them in physical appearance, and then in the revelation of their nakedness, and they were just utterly humiliated and sent home. And if that wasn't enough, Ammon started a war with Israel. And if that wasn't enough, Ammon paid another nation to get involved with the war. So chapter 10, Ammon started a bunch of nonsense, and them retreating home and Joab leaving doesn't mean that this is over. Okay? That episode is not over. It's not the time of year to finish it, but you're not to suspect that Joab returning home means, okay, we'll call it even or we'll call it quits. That's the end of the story. No. When the time of year is right, it's time to go back, and Ammon's going to answer for what they've done. That's where we're at when chapter 11 opens up. David and his men should be pursuing after Ammon now that the time of year is right. Now that it is the time of year when kings can go to war, you would suspect that Ammon has much to answer for. And they do. And so there's a war that is prepared there. Unfortunately, though David should be ready to go after them, we're told two things. He sends Joab, and he stays home. Now, of all the things that I just mentioned and of all the episode from last week, David, you know now, he shouldn't have done that. David should have been there to continue this fight, to avenge the humiliation and the insult that he and his people and his nation and his ambassadors had suffered. He should have been there. He wasn't. And that's kind of the first step in how chapter 11 begins to unfold and all of the things that are going to happen here in David as he falls into temptation and then falls to it. Now, there is a principle in God's Word in the book of Galatians chapter 5. In verse 16, Galatians chapter 5, verse 16, it says, "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." Now, one of the best ways to keep from focusing on the wrong thing is to try to stay focused on the right thing. Now, if David's attention is where it should be, a lot of the things that happened in chapter 11 could say would not have happened, right? If David's attention is where it should be, then it wouldn't have gotten to where it shouldn't be. I get it, right? Life is more than just walking around on eggshells and trying to avoid things. Life is more, there's more to it than that. But it's also true to say that you will be behind in the game if you don't have a focused determination to be where you should be, right? To focus on what you should focus on. While the Bible does tell us things to not do, things to avoid, we actually have a lot of things to replace that with. There are things that we are told to do, right? If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, whatsoever things are right, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, think on these things. It's one thing to tell you, okay, stay away from these things. Don't think about these things. If you think about these things, you're going to end up doing these things and getting yourself in a lot of trouble. That's part of it, but that's only part of it, okay? It is not just enough to say, well, don't think about these things. Paul says, think on these things. No, you don't want to walk after the lust of the flesh. Walk in the Spirit, and you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. So that's kind of a guiding principle, that try to have a determined focus of doing what you should do, being faithful in the things that you're supposed to be doing. Don't even open the door to the idea that you might be where you shouldn't be. And David kind of falters at that. Now, David should go to war. The Ammonites have insulted him. They've insulted Israel. And now David absolutely should be there to fight. This is not just another campaign. This is not just another fight. He has been personally insulted, his motives challenged, his men and his ambassadors embarrassed. This is a big deal. He chooses to stay behind, okay? And his lack of being where he should be now tells us that this whole story starts, David is not where he should be. And if he's not where he should be, he's going to end up somewhere he shouldn't be. So David lingering is how this all kind of starts. Number 2, David's temptation. David's temptation. Verse number 2 says that it came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Now, most say that word walking gives you the idea of like a pacing. Was it that David couldn't sleep? Was it, did he have a lot on his mind? Was he concerned about his men that were off at war? We don't know. But David one evening, David's pacing or walking back and forth on his roof. Something catches his eye. There was a woman, and it says there in verse number 2 that she was washing herself. She wasn't washing her hands. Okay? She was washing herself. David was able to see a lot. And as he looked, he noticed her beauty. She was beautiful to look upon. Now you'll notice in verse number 2 that it goes from what he saw to what he looked upon. There's a difference in the language. There's a difference in the words. Let me start by saying David's sin was not that he saw Bathsheba, right? That's not really where it begins. It could have been that something caught his eye. He didn't expect anybody to be up there. From when he was walking around, looking around, maybe he's not used to seeing someone. And then, over there he sees someone, and didn't expect that. Didn't know anyone was up, or out and about. Maybe he wasn't used to seeing that. But not only did he see her, once he saw her, he turned his look upon her and began to focus upon her. Now, we cannot excuse David for what happens in chapter 11. I've already told you from verse number 1, David should be somewhere else. Okay? We're going to mention that. David should be somewhere else. Let me be honest, though, in also saying this. In all the things that we've said about David, there is one thing that we've mentioned about David that he struggles with. David has already shown himself to have a vulnerability when it comes to women. How many wives does David have right now? The answer is I'm not sure, because I'm not sure how you want to count it. Do you want to count 6 or do you want to count 7? Because according to 1 Samuel chapter 25, and 2 Samuel chapter 3. We already know that he has children with at least 6 different wives. That's not including Michal. So I'm not sure how you want to count the numbers of wives, but it's probably either 6 or 7. That's not God's design. It's not God's design generally. It certainly was specifically said that kings should not multiply wives unto themselves. Deuteronomy said that. We read the verse when we came through there, okay? David's vulnerable in this area, okay? Let me say this. Then how many wives would it take to satisfy David's lust? If one woman is not enough, are we sure 6 would be? Now, I say that to say this. If we think that one more bout of giving in to lust is going to be the last time, or is going to, this will satisfy me, this would be the end of it, right? You'd be wrong. It's foolish to even presume that upon ourselves, right? That if David looks upon this woman, that this is a one-off, right? This is totally out of, this is totally out of bounds. This is totally out of the realm of possibility. It's not. And it's silly to assume that, I could give into this lust and it not go any further. David's already had 6, 7 wives by this point. Are we sure that if we give in to the next bout of lust that is going to satisfy? Sure. It might give us a temporary gratification that might hold us over for a while, but you know how long it'll hold us over? Till the next time. We should never think so much of ourselves to think that if we just give in to this next bout of lust or temptation, that, it's a one-time thing. If I do this one time, that would be it, right? And then I'll know what it's like. I'll be satisfied one time. It'll be done. Never have to worry about that again. Any amount of time thinking about that tells you, that's not true. We know that lusts, if anything, only provide a very temporary gratification. Let me say this about verse 2. Pray that God gives us strength to not let our eyes remain. Don't fix your look. If you see something that you're not supposed to see, don't go in for a closer look. Okay? We're bombarded, right, nowadays. I don't know what David was expecting to see when he was on that roof, but what he saw turned into what he fixed his look upon, okay? If he glances and looks away, you're not going to know how beautiful she is. We know that she's beautiful, and that's not what you learn from the glance. That's what he learned by looking upon her. He saw and learned and looked, and she was beautiful to look upon. We're going to see a whole bunch of stuff in our world, right? And man, we got the internet, and we got things that are right at our fingertips. You can see things and not even mean to. You could see things that you didn't intend to see. The trouble is, the longer you look, because the longer you look, the more you'll want to look. And David got in trouble with that, right? What he saw turned into what he kind of started to stare at and started to look upon. We got to try to think like Joseph, right? Joseph was presented with temptation and he got out of there, right? He got out of there so fast, he didn't even go back to get the shirt that the gal ripped off of him, right? He was like, nope, I got to get out of here. Didn't even go back for his shirt. Think like that, right? Don't think like David, that if you see something you're not supposed to see or you're put in a tempting position, don't linger there, right? We're 2 verses in, David's got a problem with lingering, right? He kind of hangs out, maybe where he He's going to put himself in a vulnerable position. Don't go places, and if you end up in a place, don't linger there if it comes out that, I'm vulnerable here. Bathsheba's great beauty made this sight very tempting. I would say also under verse 2, to remember that sin does not present itself for the ugliness that it is. Sin often looks very, very tempting. Temptation is very real because our lusts are real and our desires and our cravings in the flesh are real. And the Bible tells us that every man is tempted when he's enticed and drawn away of his own lusts. And then when lust is conceived, bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, bringeth forth death. It's hard to stop that process once it starts. And so if you can at all try to get out of the temptation, get out of the temptation. But the temptation is very real. And it's very real because sin does not present itself for the ugliness that it is. I think, Brother Meadows last week when he was here, he started talking about, I think he mentioned alcohol. And you see the commercials that are on TV and people are drinking and they're having a good time, right? And everybody's partying, everybody's laughing, and they're watching the game and they're just enjoying it. And nobody shows you the guy throwing up. And they don't show you the guy that's laying in the gutter. And they don't show you the wife and the kids that are back at home not knowing when dad's coming home. And they don't show you, all of the money that this guy is losing and throwing down the drain. And they don't show you the guy in the back of the cop car when he gets pulled over for drunk driving. And they don't show you the car that's bent around a telephone pole because they don't show you any of those things, right? Now, does that happen every single time somebody drinks? No, it doesn't happen every time somebody drinks. But it happens enough, but you never see those things, right? Sin doesn't present itself that way, okay? The devil doesn't present himself in a red suit with horns and a pitchfork. That's not how he entices people, okay? Temptation is very real. So you get to chapter 11 and you get in verse 2. David's already shown himself vulnerable in certain areas of life. David is starting to show a propensity for lingering longer than he should. And he's starting to look longer than he should. And the Bible is honest with us what happens when we hang around temptation and we allow those lusts to conceive. Verse number 3. And David sent and inquired after the woman. Number 3, David leans into the temptation. David doesn't do what Joseph did. He doesn't bail out. He doesn't get out. It's not even that David looks even a little bit longer and then goes back inside. David leans into it. He asks about her. Who's that? Does anybody know who that is? He wants to know who that is. He should have left, but he puts himself in a more tempting position. Now, the longer this goes, the greater the temptation gets. And here's the problem. And Solomon is going to relay this to us. Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. Verse 27. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 27. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet not be burned? Now, if we were to have a proverb in the year 2024, we'd use almost the exact same language in the one that we use, which is what? If you play with fire, you're going to get burnt. That is not original, right? That's a proverb from way back. David's playing with fire, right? Now not only is he seen, not only does he like what he sees, now he starts to ask about it. Who is that over there? In 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Yes, this is her name is Bathsheba. Now we're told a couple of things about her. She's the daughter, in verse number 3, of a man named Eliam. Now, if this is the same Eliam from 2 Samuel chapter 23, Eliam of 2 Samuel chapter 23 is one of David's mighty men and the son of a man named Ahithophel. If that's the same Eliam, there's some names that are mentioned multiple times, but if that's the same person, it's one of David's mighty men. And if that's not who it is, if it's not the same Eliam, I do know that Uriah the Hittite is the same one as the one that's mentioned among David's mighty men in the same chapter, 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 39. Uriah the Hittite is one of David's mighty men. So let me mention a couple things about this. Number one, she's married. David's already married several times over. So is she. This is not something that David learns later. He knows that first. He knows that before. She's married. Not only is she married, secondly, she's married to a guy that's out there fighting for him. Right? This is one of David's trusted men. David's mighty men don't show up late in time, late in this story. These are men that have been with David for a long time. Some of them before the crown was on his head. Thirdly, this means he's away. By learning that it's the wife of Uriah the Hittite, now the situation becomes even more tempting. You know why? Nobody else is. You know where Uriah is? Same place David should. Out fighting. You know how I know that? Because in verse number 6, he has to call Joab to get Uriah sent to him. You know where Joab is? First one, while fighting the Ammonites. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 8, and verse number 11, tells us something that's very, very dark about the heart of man. And we should not presume to think ourselves above falling into this snare. Okay, none of us. Ecclesiastes 8, verse 11. It says, "Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil." What does that mean? When men think that there are no consequences, look out. That is a dangerous thing. When men are put in positions where they feel that they can do something and there not being any repercussions, when there's not any consequences, that sentence against them is not going to be speedily executed, if I can get away with it, that's a bad thing to start doing. If you're in the middle of temptation, you get to the question, can I get away with it? You're heading down the wrong path, right? You're lingering too long, and David has. He's asking about her. And when he asks about her, he learns some real good information. Her husband's not home. That's not good at all. And the heart of man is such that if he feels that there aren't any consequences, that is not a good spot for him to be in. So David is starting to lean into the temptation. Number 4, David commits adultery. In our text, verse number 4, it says, "And David sent messengers and took her. She came in unto him, and he lay with her. She was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house." Go get her for me. And following that lustful impulse, David sends for her. And the Bible just tells us in specific terms, he lay with her. David committed adultery. Now, what is adultery? Adultery is voluntary sexual activity between a married person and someone who is not their spouse. There's a number of different sins, physical sins, sexual sins that are mentioned in the Bible. The Bible mentions for us to flee fornication. Fornication is sexual impurity before marriage. You're not supposed to be with someone physically, intimately, or sexually unless you are married to them. Any sex that's outside of the bond of marriage is fornication. The problem is that while all sex outside of marriage can be considered fornication, if you have one party that's married to someone else, now you have what's considered adultery. The Bible tells us specifically, right? This is on the list. You know what I mean when I say the list, right? The 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And David does. There is no way to dress this up. There's no way to clean this up other than to say, David committed adultery. He's married and she's married. They're not married to each other. That's adultery. And David committed it. David did something that the Bible says you are not supposed to do. You can debate whether David not going to war in verse number 1 was a sin. David should have gone to war. It was the right thing to do. It was the honorable thing to do. But I suppose you can debate on whether or not him going to war or not would be considered a sin. Compare it against what the commands are, all those things. You can't debate what he does in verse number 4. This sin has a heavy, heavy penalty. According to Leviticus chapter 20, I didn't read it, I didn't turn to there, but of course it was Exodus 20 verse 15 is the 10 Commandments where it tells him, thou shalt not commit adultery. It carried a heavy penalty. In Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10, it says, and the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. There's not enough complicated language in that verse to even make you think it could mean anything than the way you understood it. If two people commit adultery, they're both in trouble. David is doing exactly what it says in this verse, right? If a man, and the man committeth adultery with another man's wife, that's who Bathsheba is, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, if he can see her from the rooftop, that's his neighbor. Like there's no way to get around that David is like to the T, falling under the condemnation of Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. This is like a big-time sin with a big-time penalty. That's what we're talking about here. Now, yes, David first committed adultery with Bathsheba in his heart, didn't he? Jesus said, you've heard that it's been said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already in his heart. We're way past that, right? David's already gone to that extent in the first couple of verses. So what started in his heart is now living itself out in practice. And It is true to say that David's adultery with Bathsheba did not start in the bedroom. It started on the rooftop in his heart, but it is culminated there. He takes her and he does physically lay with her and commits adultery. Now, I don't want to say this in a way. I am not a better man than David. Okay? So let me say that. But we have to be honest. David has committed a wicked act before God. Okay? Of all the good things that we have said about David, and he is a good king, and he is a very good king, and he has shown himself in so many things to be wise and honorable and a man of God. This was wicked. This was terrible, what David did. Could it happen to us? If it could happen to David, you bet it could happen to us. If you got to guard against temptation, right? I know verse number 1, maybe that's a foolish mistake, right? Dumb mistake. David's not where he should be. Boy, it didn't take long for that to escalate, did it? You can't play with fire and not get burned. David committed adultery. And this is about as low as we've seen David thus far. Verse number 5, the repercussions. Number 5, the repercussions. And the woman conceived. Now David made the mistake, right? But guess what? Uriah is not. How's he going to know? Who's ever going to find out about it? Except for the guys that you sent to take Bathsheba. The guy that you ask about her when you're on the roof, right? But as far as anybody that would ever actually say anything, who's going to find out, right? David's going to get away with this, isn't he? Until he finds out she's with child. Their action led to pregnancy, led to her conceiving and being with child. And in verse number 4, the end of verse number 4, when it says that she was purified from her uncleanness, let me just say, when Uriah went off to war, she was not pregnant. And that verse explains that to us. She was not pregnant before this. This was something that was caused in the adultery between David and Bathsheba. You know what that means? That means they can't hide it. You know, there's some things that you can hide, right? There's things that you can hide from people. You could get into some things, you could do some things that are pretty bad, pretty rotten, and hide it from people. If a gal gets pregnant, she can't hide that. At least not longer than a few months, can she? Right? You all know what that means, right? She starts to show. It starts to become evident that she's with child. And it becomes reality now that David can't hide this. They can't hide it anymore. That's a word of caution to us, you know. We do not get to pick the repercussions of our actions. If, David commits adultery, and maybe, if one of us were to fall into such a sin like that, right? If we were to have relations outside of the bond marriage, people might say, well, what's the worst thing that happen, right? A number of things, right? You may choose those actions. There are repercussions that come along with that you might not choose or that you might not want. You could end up pregnant or getting someone pregnant. You could end up with a disease. And we're not talking about the other things like shame, right? The guilt that you bear when you've, lost your innocence and those things. You don't get to pick those things, right? David could not see the potential consequences of this. Now, you and I can tell you some of the potential consequences of adultery or fornication, right? Pregnancy, disease, shame, guilt, humiliation. I can start to list all of those out for you. The consequences of David's actions in chapter 11 are going to start to spiral, almost out of control. David's actions lead to an unwanted pregnancy, which in turn is going to lead him to commit murder, which in turn is going to result in the death of a child, which in turn is going to result in a number of things entering into David's family. One of his children taking the life of another, one of his children raping another, one of his sons, the son that's going to follow him as king of Israel, is going to fall into the exact same vulnerabilities of multiple women, and he's going to be led completely away from the worship of the true God at times from that. Like, the consequences, I know in the here and now, David's up on the roof and he's only thinking about the temporal satisfaction, the physical gratification that he's going to get in a night or two of fun while her husband is off at war. And yet, if he could only see the consequences, if he could only see the potential of what's coming down the road. Temptation is a very, very real struggle. And it's very, very hard to deal with. And I don't want to pretend that it's not. But it's also true, and the Bible tells us, you know what's really hard? The way of transgressors is hard. It says that right in the scriptures. I'll give you an example. If you say it's hard to avoid temptation, right? It's hard to keep myself pure, right? It's hard to keep myself pure from fornication. Yes, it very well may be. You know what's really hard? Being a single parent. Living with a disease. Giving a part of yourself to one person and then someday finding the person that you love and you want to marry and spend the rest of your life with, and there's not that innocence that you can give to them. Those things are hard. That's hard. You say, well, temptation's really hard. Yeah, but I'm telling you, if you give in to every bout of temptation and every lust, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard. That doesn't take away what's hard. That just starts what's hard. It gets really hard after you give in to temptation. I'm not pretending that temptation is easy, and I'm not silly enough to just say, hey, when you're tempted, just say no. Yeah, do that. If it was just that easy, sure. But it's going to take effort, right? Now, thankfully, we know that when there's temptation, there's a way of escape, right? And greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. And within us is the power to what the Bible says is overcome. We can do it. But we have to walk in the Spirit. We have to walk circumspectly. We have to learn and be molded to not give into every whim of lust or the Christian has to have a different mindset that physical gratification and temporary pleasures of this world are not what we are pursuing. We have to have the mindset that godliness and faithfulness, that Christ and His Word are what we are going to pursue first and foremost. And when we have temptation come upon us, pray that Christ gives us courage and strength to overcome and lead us to victory over those things. It's hard. But if we give in every time temptation stands at our doorstep, David's going to learn what hard is. And it's going to be real, real bad. I'm perplexed at times when I read this passage, right? Because David is how many times greater than I am as a man. And David has shown himself to be honorable probably many times over, certainly greater than I've ever shown myself to be honorable. But he fell. He gave in to temptation. And what started as a lingering became a lustful look. And in the lustful look, he started asking questions. And the more questions he asked, the more he felt convinced that he could get away with it. And after he felt that he could get away with it, he did it. And I'm not so silly to think that that's the way I think, right? Aren't there times like can I get away with this? Is anybody going to find out about this? Are there going to be any consequences? That's how we think about problems. That's the wrong way to think about things. That's the wrong way to think about temptation, right? We don't have any more time to cover any other thing else tonight. I didn't think we'd get much past verse 5 anyway. But 5 verses, this thing escalates quick. And now David's got a problem on his hands that it's gonna start to show itself, okay? David thought he could get away with it. Uriah's off to war. Nobody will ever find out. But verse 5 ends, David's in a spot where I got to do something because somebody's going to find out. He can't keep people from finding out. And so we'll learn next week what he does. And while we would hope that it would stop there, it doesn't stop there, okay? So pray that God give us victory over temptation. It is very, very real. The Christian has much to worry about, much to think about in the world in which we live. There is so much that is enticing. There is so much that would pull at us, pull at our eyes, pull at our minds. Pray and ask God to give you help. Pray and ask God to give you strength. And if there's other things that you can be doing, and if there's a wiser place to be, and there's better things to look at, jump on those things. Focus on those things. Don't get caught off, browsing, being places you shouldn't be, going places you shouldn't go, looking at things you shouldn't look at, because real quick, a sight becomes a look, and a look becomes questions, and a question becomes a wondering, can I get away with it? Will there be any repercussions? That stuff escalates real quick. Okay? God give us help. Father, we're thankful to come tonight.